Yes, indeed. Let's start with what's happening in India now. And the Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, says he is looking forward to coming to Australia to meet with leaders of the Quad.
Yeah, Mark, Modi's joining US President Biden and Japanese PM Kishida when Anthony Albanese hosts them at the Sydney Opera House in May.
In a tweet, Modi said the summit will bolster efforts to ensure a free and open Indo-Pacific and that he looked forward to strengthening the Quad collaboration.
This is the third time the leaders of the Quad are meeting in person. There was no direct mention of China or Russia, but of course those countries are going to come up. China's growing military presence in the Indo-Pacific is likely to be a discussion point, so will Russia's war in Ukraine. It's all a bit of a balancing act for Modi. He wants more cooperation from the Quad against China, but India's abstained from most United Nations votes condemning Russia's aggression. India's also importing a record amount of Russian oil, and the Kremlin is the biggest military dealer to India. We've seen frustration from other Quad members about India's position on Russia, but the Modi government has tried to play the middleman, not taking a side and trying to get Russia and the West talking.
Modi is also expected to address the Indian diaspora while he's in Sydney. And of course, Modi last visited Australia in 2014, and when he did, he addressed Parliament, obviously, but then this crowd, more than 20,000 people at Sydney's Olympic Park. So I imagine we can expect that there's going to be some kind of event that when he's out here, you would assume.
Well, obviously Indian migrants have now become the biggest diaspora in Australia, so this is a big deal for Modi and Albanese. But Mark, what I want to see is Albo in India, when he was welcomed there, his face was on billboards everywhere, 10-foot banners, chariot ride in the stadium. Is that going to happen to Modi in the SCG?
Well, what's our equivalent of a chariot would be really the question.
Like a wheelbarrow? I don't know.
Guess so. Something of that size anyway. Something else that's been making headlines in India this week is, of course, Operation Kaveri. Now, that is the mission to rescue thousands of Indians who've been stranded in Sudan as the fighting continues to rage in Khartoum.
Around 3,000 Indians were estimated to be stranded when a violent conflict broke out between Sudan's army and paramilitary forces last week. Indians stranded said they were living in fear and unable to access food or water.
देखिए हम इधर अल्पा शहर सुडान में अल्पा शहर सिटी में हम लोग 31 लोग 21 लोग हम पूरे यहाँ घर में घेराबंदी हो गए हैं। ये घर में हम लोग पूरे रुके हुए हैं। हम 4-5 दिन से समझो कि नर्क देख रहे हैं और इस घर में हम लोग पूरे हैं। कम से कम 4-5 दिन से खाना पानी भी नहीं है ठीक से। जो हमारे पास था बचा हुआ था, थोड़ा बहुत खाया था हम लोग ने। बाद में 4 दिन से जो टोटी में पानी है वो पानी पिया था। अब तक हमारे को कोई सहायता नहीं है।
India's foreign ministry said Indians are being taken on naval ships docked in Port Sudan to Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, where they are being flown back to India. With the first group arriving back in Delhi on Wednesday, more airlifts are expected after a 72-hour ceasefire was extended. Now to the state of Punjab, where a month-long manhunt for a Sikh separatist leader finally ended with his arrest earlier this week.
30-year-old self-styled preacher Amritpal Singh angers authorities with his calls for Sikh independence. So he made national headlines back in February when hundreds of his supporters stormed a police station near Amritsar to demand the release of one of his supporters. Singh was arrested in a Sikh temple in the Moga district in Punjab on Sunday. He's being held under the controversial National Security Act, which allows for individuals to be detained without charge for up to a year.
And of course, the reason Singh is making news is because he leads a group called Waris Punjab Day, which means the heirs of Punjab. And his rise is a reviving talk of an independent Sikh homeland.
Yeah, this of course is stoking a lot of fears of returns to violence that left tens of thousands of people dead during a Sikh insurgency in the 1980s and early 1990s. Singh says he supports the Khalistan movement for an independent Sikh state.
Now, in a few minutes, we're going to talk to our Punjabi writer, Amandeep Sandhu. But first, Sunil Badami explains what is Khalistan and why the Indian government is trying so hard to stop it.
For Sikhs, Khalistan means land of the Khalsa, or pure.
Sikhs believe in one God. Our place of worship called the Gurudwara are open for anyone of any faith or no faith at all. We welcome everyone with open arms to come and enjoy our meditation sessions, our langar, the free kitchen, community kitchen, which is known right around the world.
Sikhism is the world's 5th largest religion, founded at the end of the 15th century by Guru Nanak in the Indian province of Punjab. When Hindu-majority India and Muslim-majority Pakistan were partitioned in 1947 as the British left, Punjab, a Sikh-majority state, was split between the two countries. It was further split in 1966 into Sikh-majority Punjab and the Hindu-majority Haryana, despite many Sikhs' disagreement. Some Sikh political movements had called for a sovereign Sikh state as early as the 1920s, but after the bloodshed that followed partition, India was unlikely to cede any further territory to another ethno-religious state. In 1982, Sikh religious leader Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale started the Khalistan movement, which soon became armed militancy. It culminated in the 1984 storming of Sikhism's holiest shrine, the Golden Temple in Amritsar, by the Indian Army, after Bhindranwale and other militants took refuge there to avoid arrest. The raid resulted in hundreds of deaths, including Bhindranwale's, and outraged millions of Sikhs around the world. A few months later, then Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was assassinated by 2 Sikh bodyguards.
Even a visit to the site of the Sikh holy temple, which her troops attacked earlier this year, was a gesture of conciliation the Sikhs did not accept,
resulting in bloody anti-Sikh riots that killed thousands. After escalating terror attacks, including the bombing of an Air India flight off the Irish coast in 1987, and the instability devastating Punjab's economy,
for the Air India crash that killed 329 people.
Support for militant Khalistanis fell dramatically over 2 decades. Then in 2020, when Indian farmers, many Sikhs, protested in New Delhi against the Modi government's moves to reduce government subsidies.
I think the farmers' protests were for all Indian farmers, not just the Sikh farmers, but the Sikhs have sort of the limelight in a way that they set up their langars, the free food kitchens, on the border of Delhi.
Many leaders of Modi's BJP government condemned the protests as anti-national, causing attacks on Sikhs in India and abroad.
Our movement remains peaceful and will continue until we get back our rights.
Look, we've seen the hate crime against Sikhs in Harris Park.
They could have killed somebody on that night.
This revived calls for Khalistan by some overseas Sikhs. The US-based group Sikhs for Justice held an unofficial, non-binding referendum on creating an independent Khalistan between 2020 and 2023 for Canadian, British, Australian and other overseas Sikhs.
Essentially, the Sikh community here in Vancouver and in Canada in general is here to show their support.
Which saw violent clashes between them and protesting Hindus at Melbourne's Federation Square.
I think if it doesn't spill into violence on the streets from either side, we should let people think and practice what they believe in as a democratic right. I don't think we can do much as Australians into that issue, apart from letting people practice their rights and do it in a safe manner.
Attacks on Hindu temples in Melbourne followed.
I got teary. I was like, how can something like this happen? Our whole religion is about non-violence, not killing.
Look, I condemn any attacks on any place of worship, be it a Hindu temple or a Sikh Gurdwara or a mosque or a church. I think we shouldn't go down to that level.
The Indian government issued strongly worded protests to the Canadian, British and Australian governments, calling on them to stop permitting these anti-Indian activities.
ऑस्ट्रेलिया में मंदिरों पर हमलों की खबरें नियमित रूप से आ रही है। स्वाभाविक है कि ऐसे समाचार भारत में सभी लोगों को चिंतित करते हैं, हमारे मन को व्यथित करते हैं। हमारी इन भावनाओं और चिंताओं को मैंने प्रधानमंत्री एल्बेनीजी के समक्ष रखा और उन्होंने मुझे आश्वस्त किया है कि भारतीय समुदाय की सेफ्टी उनके लिए विशेष प्राथमिकता है।
Although many think the Indian government could do more too.
I think Indian government could do a lot more, especially in 2023, in being accepting of all religions of all different minorities in India.
We're joined now by Punjabi writer and journalist Amandeep Sandhu. He writes about issues affecting his state for publications like The Hindu, Scroll and Caravan. Amandeep, welcome to India Now.
Thank you so much.
Looking at the way things are playing out at the moment, do you think the government approach to Sikhs actually hardens the resistance, or is it the other way around? The behaviour of the movement is hardening the government?
It's an interesting question. See, Punjab is known for its resistance for centuries. It opposed all the invaders who came from there. It opposed Delhi, which was in power for a long time. It opposed the British. So it is government, when government pinches Punjab like this, troubles the Sikh like this, they feel a sense of greater alienation against the government. But it has still not become a Khalistan movement as such, as it was portrayed in media. I mean, the way it was portrayed on March 18th was that Khalistan was already here. There was no such thing on the ground. In fact, even after Amritpal's chase and then finally arrest, there has been no outrage in Punjab.
So why has this issue of Khalistan gained some popularity with Sikhs outside of India?
See, whenever people migrate from a country, they carry their culture with them. You are seeing in the US, various city-states are now, accepting caste as one of the big issues among the Indian population. The Sikhs who went from India were either chased out by the police, or they had cases on them, or they were just scared of the militancy movement. But they could see the strong hand of the state. They went there, they worked hard, they built their lives there, but then they also kept in their hearts somewhere pining that can we have our own country where there would be justice? To me, it seems to be an impractical dream, for various reasons. But the fact is that that's how those people feel. And the next generation there, that goes up feeding on this trauma of the previous generation. So it becomes intergenerational. And in today's world where everybody in the world can raise issues, there are so many issues which were not there in the 80s, which are now suddenly becoming issues. Khalistan also becomes one of the issues. Has the Indian state demonstrated that it wants to solve the issue? It doesn't.
There's been a lot of discussion about this issue, and I think we're looking at it very much from the outside. How would you like to change the discussion that's happening right now, Amandeep?
I would like to change it by focusing on issues of justice, on issues of what citizens of a region need, on looking at why this had sparked up recently so suddenly in the last 1.5 years since the farmers' agitation got over. The reason I feel is that the farmers' agitation actually demonstrated to the world, not only to India, that citizens can peacefully, non-violently force the government to repeal laws. I mean, 730 lives were lost in that agitation. All they are seeking is that we lost thousands of lives during the Khalistan movement, that we had come to the movement seeking a better center-state relationship. That look at what the Green Revolution has done to us. It has fed the country but devastated the state. Let's focus on real economic issues. In Punjab, it is a habit that whenever there is a political economy issue, it is turned into a religious issue and now into this anti-state, anti-national issue. I think this is the distraction that the government brings in. And I'm very sad to say that most media, at least almost all of print media in India, electronic media, they just buy into it wholesale. Come to Punjab, listen to Punjab, talk to the people there. Nobody is really talking about Khalistan, but everybody is focused on justice.
Aman, Punjab has obviously had to deal with so much as a state, and you've talked about it needing to heal. Is that possible when there is so much going on at the moment?
Of course, healing is possible. It's possible in all situations. If there were no healing, why were we struggling? But it can heal if the Indian government exerts and shows that it is really interested in solving Punjab's problems. I don't think any government in the last 75 years, irrespective of party, has ever tried to solve Punjab's problem. I mean, the vibe in Punjab is that we are the food-producing colony of India. And that's not a good feeling for any citizen to feel about their nation. So the government can solve it, but it is not trying to solve it. It's not even moving in that direction. All it does is this kind of propaganda that keeps happening. And some Sikhs abroad, they also get agitated. They have also done attacks on various embassies. So that feeds into the propaganda that the government wants to build.
Amandeep, thank you so much for joining us on India Now. It's been fascinating. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Around 2% of people in India live with a disability, which means there are about 26 million different stories of exactly what that means. Nidhi Goyal is blind, but that hasn't stopped her from becoming India's first disabled stand-up comedian and an influential disability and gender rights activist.
Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for Miss Nidhi Goyal!
For me, disability brings a lot of, experience of disability rather, brings a lot of hilarity in life.
Someone came up to me and said, excuse me, do you have a problem? And I was, in one of my moods and I said, no, do you?
And what comedy does is it eases this discomfort, right? It brings to the table things that you may be very uncomfortable talking about. And it helps you reflect. What, madam, you have such a lovely house, so educated people, how can there be someone disabled here? So she said, but I'm blind, I'm disabled. Oh, madam, you said you're married? Yeah, but I'm blind. Madam, you said, hey, you have a baby also. Bhai sab, to have a baby, I don't need eyes. When I was diagnosed, my father was approached by his friend who told him that, listen, like maybe you shouldn't reveal her disability that she's been diagnosed and, she'll soon turn 18 and just get her married because otherwise she'll be a burden on you for the rest of her life and your life. And he turned around and said that she's really not a burden and my duty as a father at this point is to support her while she discovers her potential, to push her as she moves ahead on this journey of empowerment. Thank you so much. Hi everybody, good afternoon. It's a pleasure being here. Thank you so much for inviting me. If I had to talk about the stigma in India, for me it really comes from several spaces and comes from invisibility of people with disabilities. Representation is the second point, and I think media plays a very, very important role. So not just news media, but also, in your commercial media, in advertising, in films, in other representations, are we seeing people with disabilities enough in those spaces? Why would women with disabilities not get married? Because somehow women with disabilities are not considered women enough. For women with disabilities, we reduce everything to their disability, right? You will not be able to manage a child. Why? Because you're quote-unquote disabled. Do you even know how to do that? Why would you be in a relationship? You would be a burden. And how would you assume that we'd be a burden? Because women are assumed to be providers of care, and people with disabilities are assumed to be receivers of care. I often say that disability doesn't stop us from having experiences, from living a full life. What does is the environment. What stops us is the attitude of the people around us. When you have this charity approach rather than a rights-based approach, it's really, really annoying as a disabled person. Because you end up infantilizing a disabled person. You don't think that they're grown up. Well, it creates so many social hindrances and barriers, right? Because of the sympathy and charity, people with disabilities, eventually many of them start having these self-doubts because they feel like, oh my God, yes, maybe what everyone's saying is right. We only can receive care and we cannot be empowered, or we're not someone who could be independent. So it has long-term damaging consequences.
Now, how history is told in textbooks is always a hot topic of conversation, and recent changes to the school books of Indian children are creating a very similar stir.
Yeah, the Indian government has been accused of rewriting history to suit its political and religious agenda, removing key details from India's past. But those behind the change say it's about taking pressure off the Indian students. Reporter Hannah Joes explains.
Why was Mahatma Gandhi killed? What were the 2002 Gujarat riots? What is evolution? For students in India now, these pretty key questions may no longer be answered in your textbook.
I haven't heard of history chapters being removed before this, and I've been teaching from 1981.
Now, the books no longer mention that Nathuram Godse, the man who killed Gandhi, had ties to Hindu extremists, or that the 2002 Gujarat riots under Narendra Modi as Chief Minister ever happened. Now, those riots killed at least 1,000 people, most of them Muslims.
So we decided to look at 21 textbooks of social science from grades 6 to 12, given that the party in power, that's the BJP, that it has been in controversy even in the past for changes made to social science textbooks. There seem to be a lot of changes, deletions pertaining to events in contemporary Indian histories. We saw a lot of deletions made with regard to democracy. There were many changes pertaining to caste and discrimination. So there are 3 detailed references to the Gujarat riots. What happened as part of the exercise last year was that 2 of those 3 references, events leading up to the riots and what happened after that, have been dropped. When the NCERT reprinted the textbooks with all of these changes, we noticed that the lone surviving reference to the Gujarat riots have also been dropped. So with that, we don't really have any detailed reference to the Gujarat riots in the NCERT social sciences textbooks anymore. Another thing that jumped out for us was Gandhi's difficult relationship with Hindu extremists. They dropped references or sentences on his difficult relationship with the Hindu extremists, how they hated his idea of a secular India, that India should be for Hindus and Muslims, and the extremists, on the other hand, envision India as a country for Hindus.
And as for evolution, more than 1,800 people from India's scientific community have demanded that the theory of evolution be reinstated in textbooks for years 9 and 10. 250 academics and historians have objected to the deletions in history and sociology, including deletions of Muslim history and social revolutions.
This is exactly what the Bharatiya Janata Party and RSS want. They want to remove all Muslim presence from Indian imagination. And that is why history is very important for them. But similarly, they also want democracy to be known as a procedural thing in which citizens only vote. And therefore, they don't want the children to talk about social movements or protest movements, which give citizens their agency.
India's Hindutva leaders have been on a mission to end what they call the glorification of invaders.
Leaders of current dispensation have been talking about a lot, the need to correct history, to restore some kind of a balance. Towards that end, it seemed like a lot of deletions had been made pertaining to chapters on Mughals and Muslim rulers of India. There have been 3 rounds of changes to the NCERT textbooks since 2014. Why this exercise is making news is because it just stands out in terms of the scale of changes that have been made. Some of these changes are sweeping. There are chapters that have been dropped.
The Mughals, Muslim conquerors from Central Asia, ruled India 100 years longer than the British, and there have been deep cuts to the chapters about them.
In 1700, in fact, we have the Mughal Empire controls 25% of the world's GDP. Its polity, its administration, the clothes, everything has influences our everyday life.
The National Council of Educational Research and Training, NCERT, has denied accusations that its deletions are based on ideology. Its director, Professor Dinesh Prasad Saklani, said the removals were part of an unbiased rationalization process to ease the burden on Indian students, some of the most stressed in the world.
Rationalization would be that we remove a little bit of information from each chapter and make each chapter a little shorter so that nothing is left out.
But BJP leader Kapil Mishra sees the changes a little differently.
It is a great decision to remove false history of Mughals from NCERT. Thieves, pickpockets and 2 penny road raiders were called the Mughal Sultanate and the Emperor of India.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating story, Mark, and a really interesting situation that is effectively a culture war happening in India. We're not just seeing this in textbooks, we're seeing Bollywood. We're seeing culture, music, parts of Indian arts being sort of shifted to suit this Hindu nationalist agenda, which is something we've spoken about a lot on the show, right? And I think what's really interesting, what experts are really worried about, is how this will affect young people. What will this mean for the next generation of Indians who are learning a very particular part of Indian history? But I think what I've found really interesting to watch is that the Taj Mahal is actually built by a Mughal emperor.
Yeah, I was
right?
going to say.
And so that is like the image of India itself. So where is this all going to go? It's going to be really interesting to watch.
Yeah, I mean, obviously what is in and what is out is a subject to debate, and teachers will argue that. But I do just think I have more than a passing interest in Indian history, and I think it's impossible to tell the story of India and South Asia in general without talking about things like the Mughal Empire. It's influential in ways that are hard to quantify, and the relevance to teenagers at the moment in India, I'm sure is something that can be debated. But we're talking about a particular part of the world that has an incredibly rich history, and it's overlapping, and it's messy, and in parts it's brutal. And I guess this is the romantic attitude I have to history, which is that's interesting. And it's an interesting thing to get into the messiness of it. And if the argument is to simplify it for teenagers, I'm actually, and again, without going into the detail of the curriculum, I would actually say you run the risk of removing the messiness that really tells the story of the region. And given how many Indians and South Asians there are around the world, that's the messiness of the world right there.
Totally, Mark. And the interesting thing is the Indian government is defending this using this idea of stress, which is a big issue for Indian students, right? We hear about that a lot. It's saying that these sections of the curriculum are repetitive and unnecessary. So it has an argument there as well. It's just turning into this big conflict in the country. Now we're heading to India's south, to the coastal region of Karnataka, where a traditional form of theatre is still thriving after hundreds of years. It's called Yakshagana. Our producer Tejas Bhatt has this story from Karnataka.
Just off a busy street in the coastal city of Mangalore, these performers are preparing for a busy night. They're part of a troupe called Sri Katil Durga Parameshwari Prasadita Yakshagana Mandali, and they'll be performing Yakshagana. It's a centuries-old form of folk theatre native to the South Indian states of Karnataka and the northern part of Kerala. The shows are retellings of ancient Indian epics, and tonight I'm witnessing the Sri Devi Mahatma story. Tonight's story is a 1500-year-old text about the goddess Durga leading the forces of good against the demon Mahishasura. It's a vibrant scene full of bright colours and loud music. The performers take their cues from the Bhagavata, or the narrator, and they act out his words. There's actually a big element of improvisation here, allowing actors to inject their own flair into a story. I remember my grandma taking me to a Yakshagana play when I was a kid, and it was a sensory experience that I still carry with me today. This particular show takes place literally in the middle of the street, in one of the city's busiest junctions. Traffic moves around the audience while the loud music reverberates through the city, and you can feel the warm air on your skin. Traditionally, these shows run all night, from sunset to sunrise. But shows in recent years, like this one, are ending at a more reasonable time, around midnight. And if you find yourself feeling hungry, you can always enjoy an authentic South Indian dinner just around the corner.